Have you ever been betrayed by your own mother? She stood by while they destroyed everything my father built. Together, they tore apart his legacy piece by piece, selling his tools, ripping out his handcrafted shelves, erasing every trace of the man who raised me. But they didn't know one crucial detail. I was the legal owner of that house, and when the truth finally came to light, everything they'd built on their lies would come crashing down in an instant. My name is Sophia Hale, and at 33, I've built a solid career as a senior software architect at Northbridge Technologies in Portland. But before I became who I am today, I was Richard Hale's daughter, and that identity shaped everything about me. My father wasn't just a construction contractor. He was an artist who worked with wood and stone. He built Hale restorations from nothing. Starting with just his truck and a toolbox he inherited from his own father, over 30 years, he transformed it into one of the most respected restoration companies in Oregon. But more than buildings, Dad built values, integrity, responsibility, and the kind of trust that made clients become friends and employees become family. Our Craftsman house in Willow Creek was his masterpiece, the first major restoration project that put his name on the map. Built in 1923, it had been destined for demolition when Dad bought it for a song in 1985. He spent 3 years bringing it back to life, preserving every original detail he could save. The Douglas fir beams, the built-in cabinets, the hardwood floors that creaked in just the right places. Every corner of that house held his fingerprints, from the custom shelves in the library to the workshop out back where he taught me the difference between various wood grains. A house isn't just walls and a roof, Sophie, he'd tell me while we worked together in his shop. It's a legacy. It's what you leave behind that says you were here, that you mattered. Those Saturday mornings in his workshop weren't just about learning carpentry. Dad taught me about planning, precision, and patience. Measure twice, cut once, became my mantra not just in woodworking but in coding. Always have a backup plan translated perfectly to system architecture. Take care of your tools, and they'll take care of you, taught me to value and maintain my relationships, both personal and professional. When Dad passed suddenly from a heart attack at 59, he left everything meticulously organized. The Hale family security protocol, as he called it with his typical dry humor, was a comprehensive estate plan that would make any lawyer proud. Every asset cataloged, every wish documented, every possible scenario anticipated. The house in Willow Creek, along with the majority of his other assets, was placed in my name through an irrevocable trust he'd established years earlier. I'm leaving the house to you, Sophie. He'd told me when he set up the trust. Your mother isn't good with money. We both know that. And I need to know the house will be protected. You understand what it means, what it represents. Promise me you'll take care of it. I promised, never imagining I'd have to protect it from my own mother. The house wasn't just property to me. It was the pencil marks on the doorframe charting my height every birthday. It was the kitchen where Dad taught me to make his famous Dutch apple pie. It was the library where he read me stories. The garden where we planted tomatoes every spring. The porch where we watched thunderstorms roll in across the valley. After Dad died, I thought Mom understood this. For the first few months, she seemed to cherish these memories too. Maintaining his garden, keeping his workshop exactly as he'd left it. We grieved together in that house, surrounded by the beautiful things he'd built. I had no idea that grief could make someone vulnerable to the worst kind of manipulation. I had no idea that my mother would choose a stranger over her daughter, or that she would help destroy everything my father had worked to preserve. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how it all fell apart, you need to understand how Steve Coleman entered our lives. 6 months after Dad's funeral, Mom started attending a grief support group at First Presbyterian. I encouraged it. She needed to talk to people who understood what she was going through. When she mentioned meeting someone named Steve Coleman who'd lost his wife to cancer, I was genuinely happy for her. She deserved companionship, someone who could relate to her loss. He's very kind, she told me over coffee one Sunday. He understands what it's like to lose your partner. We've been having coffee after the meetings. At first, The changes were subtle. Mom started wearing brighter colors instead of the muted tones she'd favored for years. She got a new haircut, shorter, more styled. She joined a book club Steve recommended. I saw these as positive signs, evidence that she was healing, moving forward. But then the changes accelerated. 3 months after meeting Steve, Mom stopped tending Dad's vegetable garden. "It's too much work," she said, though she'd always found it therapeutic before. The tomato plants Dad had started from seed withered and died. She donated his gardening tools to Goodwill without asking if I wanted them. "Mom, those were Dad's," I protested when I discovered the empty garden shed. "Sophia, we need to stop living in the past," she replied, using a phrase I'd soon learn was Steve's favorite. "Your father wouldn't want us to turn this house into a shrine." The irony was bitter. Dad had specifically wanted the house preserved, and I had the documents to prove it, but I held my tongue, thinking Mom needed time to process her grief in her own way. Steve started appearing at the house more frequently. A dinner here, a weekend afternoon there. He was charming in that practiced way that should have set off alarm bells. Silver-haired, always impeccably dressed. He had the smooth demeanor of a man who'd spent his life in sales, which, I later learned, he had failed sales, mostly, a string of bankruptcies and business ventures that never quite panned out. 5 months after they met, Steve moved in, bringing his 2 adult children with him. Liam, 31, supposedly a personal trainer but really just unemployed, and Samantha, 28, who called herself an influencer despite having fewer than 500 followers on Instagram. "It's temporary," Mom assured me when I expressed surprise at this sudden development. Steve's rental lease ended, and it didn't make sense for him to find another place when we spend so much time together. The kids just need a place to stay while they get back on their feet. I watched Steve survey the house that first day he moved in, his eyes calculating. He ran his hands along the original woodwork, tested the floors with his heel, examined the fixtures in a way that made my skin crawl. It wasn't appreciation, it was appraisal. "This place has good bones," he announced, as if his assessment mattered. "But it needs updating. No one wants all this dark wood anymore. We could really increase the value with some modern touches." "The value doesn't matter," I said carefully. "This is Mom's home." I didn't add that it was actually my house. That seemed cruel to point out in front of Mom. Steve smiled that salesman's smile. "Everything has value. Sophia, your father knew that. He was a businessman, after all." The way he invoked my father's name, as if he knew him, as if he understood him, made my jaw clench. Dad would have seen through Steve Coleman in 30 seconds. He had an uncanny ability to spot what he called takers, people who consumed others' resources without contributing anything meaningful in return. Within a month, Steve had essentially taken over the household. He rearranged the living room furniture, claiming it had better flow. He replaced Dad's coffee maker with some expensive machine that required special pods. He started parking in Dad's spot in the garage, moving Mom's car to the driveway. "Steve knows about these things," Mom would say whenever I questioned a change. "He's very knowledgeable about home improvement." But Steve's knowledge seemed limited to destruction rather than improvement. He talked constantly about modernizing and updating, words that translated to erasing every trace of my father's craftsmanship, and Mom, inexplicably, supported every suggestion he made. The woman who had sobbed when we accidentally broke one of Dad's coffee mugs now stood by while Steve dismissed my father's life's work as dated and old-fashioned. It was as if Steve had hypnotized her, replaced her memories with his vision of what our life should be. I should have acted then, should have asserted my ownership, set boundaries, protected what Dad had left in my care, but I kept thinking Mom would wake up, would remember who she was and what Dad meant to us. I was wrong. The Saturday I discovered Steve's true intentions, I'd come by to help Mom with her computer. What I found instead was a construction crew in the library, ripping out the built-in bookshelves my father had spent 6 months crafting by hand. "Stop!" I shouted, running into the room. "What are you doing?" The crew leader looked confused. "We're on schedule for the renovation, ma'am. Mr. Coleman said, "Mr. Coleman doesn't own this house." My hands were shaking. Those shelves were made from reclaimed old-growth redwood Dad had salvaged from a demolished Victorian. Each joint was perfect, every shelf custom-fitted. Everyone out, now. Steve appeared in the doorway, calm as ever. "Sophia, you're overreacting. We're just updating the space. Open floor plans are what buyers want." Buyers? The word hit me like ice water. "This house isn't for sale." "Not yet," he said with that infuriating smile. "But your mother and I have been discussing downsizing. This place is too big for us. Too much maintenance." "Any changes to this property require the owner's written consent," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "That's me, Steve. I own this house." His smile flickered but held. "You may have some claim on paper, but Margaret lives here. This is her home. We don't need your permission to improve our living space." The calculated way he said "our" made everything clear. This had always been his plan. Move in, stake a claim, and cash out. My mother was just his pathway to a payday. Over the next weeks, the violations accelerated. Liam converted Dad's workshop into his personal gym, selling off the vintage tools to a dealer for quick cash. The beautiful old Delta band saw from 1952, gone. The hand planes Dad had collected over 30 years, sold. The custom workbench he'd built with his own father, hauled away like garbage. "That stuff was just collecting dust," Liam said when I confronted him. "At least now it's useful." He flexed in the mirror he'd installed where Dad's tool cabinet used to be, admiring his own reflection. Samantha was equally destructive. She decided the original hardwood floors were too loud for her TikTok videos and had them covered with cheap vinyl planking. "It's not permanent," she assured me, but I'd seen the construction adhesive they'd used. Those floors would never be the same. "Mom," I pleaded during one of our increasingly rare moments alone. "Dad restored those floors on his hands and knees. Don't you remember? You brought him lemonade every afternoon that summer." "Steve says hardwood is high maintenance," she replied, not meeting my eyes. "He's thinking practically about our future." "What future? He's destroying everything Dad built." "Your father is gone. Sophia," her voice turned sharp. "Steve is here. He's helping me move forward instead of living in the past like you." The accusations stung, but what hurt more was the stranger my mother had become. She parroted Steve's opinions, defended his every decision, and turned on anyone who questioned him, including me. I documented everything, every alteration, every sale, every violation of the property. My phone filled with photos of the destruction. The hand-carved newel post Liam broke while moving his weight equipment. The antique light fixtures Samantha replaced with generic store-bought ones. The garden Dad had carefully landscaped, now paved over for Steve's RV parking. The final straw came when I arrived to find them preparing to demolish the bay window in the breakfast nook, the spot where Dad and I had eaten countless Sunday pancakes, where he'd taught me to read blueprints, where we'd planned my college applications. "That's enough," I said, pulling out my phone to call Robert Hayes, our family lawyer. "I want you all out." Steve actually laughed. "You can't evict us. Sophia, your mother lives here. I'm her partner. We have rights." "You have no rights to destroy my property," I countered. "And yes, it is legally mine, every inch of it." "You would throw your own mother out?" He played his trump card, knowing Mom was listening from the kitchen. What kind of daughter does that? Mom emerged then, and the look on her face broke my heart. "Sophia, how can you be so selfish, after everything I've done for you?" "Everything you've done? Mom, you're letting him destroy Dad's legacy." "Your father's legacy was leaving us secure," she said, and I could hear Steve's words coming from her mouth. "Not trapping us in an old house full of memories." That's when I understood. Steve hadn't just moved into our house. He'd colonized my mother's mind, replaced her memories with his narrative. And if I wanted to save what was left of my father's legacy, I'd have to fight them both. The meeting with Mom was supposed to be just the two of us, a chance to talk without Steve's influence. I'd asked her to meet me at the coffee shop where we used to go with Dad, hoping familiar surroundings might break through whatever hold Steve had on her. She arrived 15 minutes late, and I could tell immediately that she'd told Steve about our meeting. She had that defensive posture, arms crossed before she even sat down. "Mom, I need you to understand something," I began carefully. "The house legally belongs to me. Dad set it up that way to protect you, to protect us." "I know what you're doing," she interrupted. "Steve warned me you'd try to manipulate me with legal technicalities." "Legal technicalities? Mom, it's Dad's will, his trust, his wishes." "Your father isn't here anymore," she said coldly. "Steve is my partner now. He's helping me build a new life, and you can't stand it. He's using you, Mom. Can't you see that? He moved in after knowing you for 5 months. His kids are destroying everything Dad built. He's already talking about selling." "We need a fresh start," she recited. "The house is too big, too expensive to maintain." "Since when? Dad left you financially secure. The house is paid off. The maintenance fund he set up covers all expenses for the next 20 years. She shifted uncomfortably. "Steve has investment opportunities. We could do so much more with the capital tied up in that old house." There it was. Steve's real agenda laid bare. "What investments? Mom, has he shown you any actual business plans? Any proof of his success?" "He doesn't need to prove anything to me. I trust him." She stood up. "Which is more than I can say about you. Steve said you'd try to turn me against him because you want the house all to yourself." "Mom, I have my own house. I don't need Dad's. I just want to preserve it, like he asked me to." "No, you want to control me. Steve says you've always been jealous of my relationships, that you can't handle me moving on." The manipulation was so transparent it would have been laughable if it weren't so painful. Steve had poisoned her against me, her own daughter, using classic isolation tactics. "Mom, when have I ever—" "I don't want to hear it." She grabbed her purse. "Steve and I are making improvements to our home. If you can't support that, maybe you shouldn't come around anymore." The ultimatum hung between us. Choose Steve's narrative or lose my mother. But what she didn't understand was that I'd already lost her, to a con artist who saw her grief as an opportunity. After she left, I sat in that coffee shop for an hour, staring at the booth where Dad used to sit. He would have known how to handle this. He always knew how to reach Mom when she got stubborn, but he also would have seen Steve coming a mile away. The next day, Steve escalated. He started a campaign to turn our extended family and community against me. The story he spun was masterful in its manipulation. The grieving widow finding new love, the selfish daughter trying to steal her mother's home, the brave stepfather standing up for his beloved's rights. My phone began buzzing with messages. "Aunt Linda, how could you threaten to evict your own mother? Your father would be ashamed." "Cousin Marie, Steve told us you're trying to sell the house out from under them. That's disgusting." "Mrs. Patterson from next door, your poor mother is heartbroken. Thank God she has Steve to support her." Even Pastor Williams from Mom's church called. "Sophia, I'm concerned about this situation with your mother. Perhaps we should discuss honoring thy father and mother." "Pastor Williams," I said, trying to stay calm. "That house belongs to me legally. My father specifically arranged it that way. They're destroying everything he built." "Material possessions shouldn't come between family," he replied. "Steve and Margaret are building a life together. Surely your father would want your mother to be happy." The irony burned. Everyone was so concerned about Mom's happiness that they couldn't see she was being systematically fleeced by a professional manipulator. The social pressure intensified. At the grocery store, people I'd known my whole life avoided eye contact. At the gas station, Jim Fletcher, Dad's old poker buddy, shook his head at me in disappointment. "Your dad was a good man," he said. "Shame you didn't inherit his generous spirit." Steve was winning the PR war, painting me as the villain in a story he was writing, and Mom, fully under his spell, was his most convincing witness. She told everyone who would listen how I was trying to control her life and punish her for finding love again. The isolation was almost unbearable. These people had known me since I was born. They'd attended my birthday parties, my high school graduation, my father's funeral. Now they looked at me like I was some greedy monster trying to throw my widowed mother into the street. But the worst part was knowing that while everyone was focused on this fabricated drama, Steve was systematically stripping the house of everything valuable, everything meaningful, everything that made it my father's legacy. I had two choices: give in and watch Steve destroy everything, or fight back and risk losing my mother forever. Dad had taught me that the hardest choices were often the clearest ones. When someone shows you who they are, he used to say, believe them the first time. Steve had shown me exactly who he was. Now it was time to show him who I was, Richard Hale's daughter, and the rightful owner of his legacy. The text messages started on a Tuesday morning while I was in a meeting at work. Mom, Steve's daughter Lisa is pregnant. They need the downstairs bedroom for a nursery. Mom, we're converting your father's office tomorrow. Mom, Steve says you won't mind since you never use it anyway. I excused myself from the meeting and called immediately. Steve answered Mom's phone. Sophia, your mother's in the shower. Exciting news about Lisa, isn't it? A baby in the family. Steve, that office stays as it is. It contains important family documents and... Oh, those old papers? We've been meaning to clear those out. So much clutter. Lisa needs a proper space for the baby. She doesn't live there, Steve. She will be. Housing is so expensive for young families. Your mother and I want to help. After he hung up, I drove straight to the house. What I found in Dad's office made my knees buckle. They'd already started. Boxes of Dad's business records were stacked by the door marked trash. His drafting table had been disassembled. The filing cabinets were empty, their contents scattered across the floor. But the worst violation was the door frame. The pencil marks tracking my height from age 2 to 18, gone, painted over with stark white paint. It was just old pencil marks, Mom said when she found me running my fingers over the fresh paint. Steve said it looked messy. Dad made those marks, I whispered. Every birthday, every single year, you held the ruler. That was a long time ago, Sophia. It was our history, Mom, our family's history. Steve is my family now, she said. Lisa's baby will be my grandchild. Lisa's baby isn't even related to you. Family isn't just blood, she snapped. Steve taught me that. Family is who shows up, who stays, who doesn't try to control everything. The irony was suffocating. Steve had shown up 5 months ago. I'd been here for 33 years. The community pressure intensified when news of Lisa's pregnancy spread. Steve made sure everyone knew that I was trying to evict a pregnant woman. The narrative was perfect. Heartless daughter versus expectant mother. My phone became a weapon against me. How dare you threaten a pregnant woman? Text from a church member I'd known since childhood. Your selfishness is putting an unborn baby at risk. Facebook message from Mom's book club friend. What kind of person makes a pregnant woman homeless? Email from someone I didn't even recognize. Steve had weaponized an unborn child against me, and it was working. Even my own friends started questioning me. Maybe you should just let it go, my best friend Sarah suggested over lunch. It's just a house. It's not just a house, I tried to explain. It's everything my father built. It's his legacy. But your mom is still alive. Isn't her happiness more important than preserving some shrine to your dad? Even Sarah didn't understand. No one did. They saw Steve's performance, the devoted partner, the protective father, the generous man opening his home to his pregnant daughter. They didn't see the systematic destruction, the calculated manipulation, the slow erosion of everything my father had created. The final blow came when I discovered they'd thrown away Dad's architecture awards. 23 years of excellence, recognition for restoration projects that had saved historic buildings throughout Oregon, all in a dumpster behind the house. I climbed into that dumpster in my work clothes, fishing out what I could save. A neighbor photographed me and sent it to Steve. Within hours, the photo was circulating with the caption, "So desperate for attention, she's literally digging through trash." But in that dumpster, I found something Steve had overlooked. Dad's personal journal from the year before he died. His handwriting, still so familiar, contained a passage that stopped me cold. "I worry about Margaret. She's too trusting, too eager to see the good in everyone. That's why I've arranged everything through the trust. Sophia will protect what I've built. She understands that some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight is ugly, even when everyone turns against you. She has my stubborn streak, my unwillingness to let go of what matters. Margaret will hate it, but someday she'll understand. The house isn't just property. It's proof that we were here, that we built something lasting." Reading those words in that dumpster, covered in dirt and debris, I realized Dad had seen this coming. Not Steve specifically, but something like him, someone who would see Mom's grief as an opportunity. That night, I made my decision. I would file for formal eviction. I would use every legal tool at my disposal. I would be the villain in their story, if that's what it took to save my father's legacy. But first, I needed to document everything. Every violation, every destroyed item, every change they'd made without permission. The law was on my side, even if no one else was. Steve thought he'd isolated me, turned everyone against me. He thought social pressure would make me cave, but he'd miscalculated one crucial thing. I was Richard Hale's daughter, and like my father, I didn't give up on what mattered, no matter how hard the fight. The real battle was about to begin. Robert Hayes had been my father's lawyer for 20 years. His office still had the same leather chairs where I'd sat as a teenager while Dad updated his will. Now, those chairs held the weight of my decision to fight my own mother. "Your father was very specific in his instructions," Robert said, spreading the documents across his mahogany desk. "The Hale family security protocol is ironclad. The house is yours through an irrevocable trust. Margaret has lifetime residency rights, but, and this is crucial, only if the property is maintained according to the trust's specifications. Which means? No structural changes without trustee approval, no sale of fixtures or original features, no alterations that diminish the historical value of the property." He adjusted his glasses. "From what you've documented, they've violated every single provision." The photographs I'd taken told the story. Gutted workshop, destroyed floors, demolished built-ins. Each image was dated, cataloged, cross-referenced with before photos from Dad's own documentation. "This is enough for eviction?" I asked. "More than enough, but Sophia, you need to understand what you're starting. This will get ugly." "It's already ugly, Robert." He nodded slowly. "Your father sat in that same chair 5 years ago." He said, "Robert, someday someone might try to take advantage of Margaret's good nature. When that happens, I need to know Sophia will have the tools to protect what I've built." He knew you'd make the hard choices if necessary. We hired a property assessment firm to document the damage. The inspector, a thorough man named David Kim, walked through the house with barely concealed horror. "This original woodwork," he said, running his hand along a damaged door frame. "This is irreplaceable. They painted over old-growth redwood. Do you have any idea what that was worth?" My father knew exactly what it was worth. That's why he preserved it. David's report was damning, over $200,000 in damages, not counting the items sold or discarded. The vintage tools alone were valued at $30,000. The hardwood floors would cost $50,000 to properly restore, if they could be restored at all. "They've destroyed the historical integrity of the property," David concluded. "This isn't renovation, it's vandalism." Armed with documentation, Robert filed the eviction notice. 60 days to vacate. The papers were served on a Thursday afternoon. I wasn't there, but I heard about Steve's reaction from 3 different neighbors within an hour. "He went ballistic," Mrs. Chen from across the street told me, "screaming about ungrateful children and inheritance theft. Your poor mother was in tears." The retaliation was swift. Steve organized what he called a family meeting, but was really a public shaming. He invited relatives, neighbors, church members, anyone who might pressure me to back down. I was summoned to appear and explain myself. I could have refused. Robert advised me to avoid it, but I went, armed with my own ammunition. The house was packed, at least 30 people crammed into the living room that Steve had modernized with flat-pack furniture and generic art from Target. Mom sat in Dad's old recliner, the one piece Steve hadn't managed to throw out yet, looking pale and drawn. Sophia has decided to evict her own mother, Steve announced to the assembled crowd. A widow who took her in, raised her, sacrificed everything for her. And why? Because she can't stand to see Margaret happy with someone new. The murmurs of disapproval rippled through the room. I recognized faces from my childhood. Sunday school teachers, Dad's bowling team, Mom's garden club friends, all looking at me with disappointment and disgust. "That's not," I started. "Let him finish," Mom interrupted, her voice cold. Steve continued his performance for another 20 minutes. He painted himself as the savior who'd rescued Mom from loneliness, me as the jealous daughter who couldn't let go of the past. He even brought up Lisa's pregnancy again, voice breaking as he described how I was destroying his family's future. When he finally finished, the room waited for my defense. I could feel their judgment, their certainty that I was the villain in this story. I pulled out my laptop and connected it to Mom's TV. The new 70-inch Steve had bought with money I suspected came from selling Dad's tools. "Before you pass judgment," I said, "let me show you something." The first image was the house as Dad had restored it. The next showed the current state. I went through them methodically, before and after, preservation and destruction. This built-in bookshelf took my father 6 months to craft. Steve had it demolished in 2 hours. Click. These floors were original 1923 Douglas fir. Now they're covered in adhesive vinyl. Click. This was Dad's workshop. Steve sold every tool and turned it into a gym. Click. These pencil marks tracked my height for 16 years. They painted over them last week. The room had gone silent. Some people shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward, seeing the destruction for the first time. "My father left this house in trust to preserve it," I said, "not to watch it be stripped for parts by someone who showed up 5 months ago with bankruptcy papers and a sob story." "How dare you?" Steve sputtered, but the crowd's energy had shifted. I pulled out one final document, Dad's handwritten letter, the one I'd found in the dumpster. "My father wrote this the year before he died. Let me read you one line. The house isn't just property. It's proof that we were here, that we built something lasting." I looked directly at Mom. "Dad knew someone might try to take advantage of your grief. That's why he protected the house through the trust. That's why he gave me the responsibility to preserve it. I'm not evicting you, Mom. I'm evicting the man who's destroying everything Dad built while convincing you it's for your own good." The room erupted in chaos, but I walked out. I'd said what needed to be said. The truth was out there now, whether they believed it or not. The intervention Steve orchestrated was his biggest production yet. He'd spent 2 weeks preparing, calling it a family healing session to anyone who'd listen. The invitation list read like my life's directory: former teachers, childhood friends, Dad's business associates, even my pediatrician from 20 years ago. When I arrived that Saturday afternoon, the house was fuller than I'd ever seen it. Steve had rearranged everything like a theater, with chairs facing the living room center where a single chair waited, clearly meant for me. "Thank you for coming, Sophia," Steve said, his voice dripping with false concern. "We're all here because we love you and want to help you through this difficult time." I remained standing. "This isn't an intervention, Steve. It's a tribunal." "See?" He turned to the crowd. "This defensiveness, this hostility, this is what we're dealing with. Margaret is heartbroken." Mom sat in the front row, surrounded by her church friends. She wouldn't meet my eyes. For 2 hours, they took turns. Each person had been coached, fed Steve's version of events. They spoke about honoring parents, about forgiveness, about letting go of material possessions. Mrs. Blackwood, my 3rd-grade teacher, actually said I needed to learn to share like we taught you in school. I sat there, silent, letting them exhaust themselves. Steve had positioned himself as the master of ceremonies, occasionally wiping away fake tears, comforting Mom with theatrical gestures. "Your father would be ashamed," said Bill Morrison, who'd worked with Dad for 10 years. He valued family above everything. That was my breaking point. Not anger, clarity. I stood up slowly, pulled a folder from my bag. "You want to talk about what my father valued? Let me show you exactly what Richard Hale valued." I held up the first document, the original trust papers. "This is dated 5 years before he died. He put the house in an irrevocable trust with me as the sole beneficiary. Why? Let me read his exact words. To preserve and protect the architectural heritage of this property from any future claim, lien, or manipulation." I pulled out the next paper. "This is a letter from Dad to Robert Hayes, his lawyer. Quote, 'I love Margaret, but she's vulnerable to people who prey on kindness. This arrangement ensures no future relationship can threaten what I've built.'" The room had gone completely silent. "Here's the property assessment from last week. $200,000 in damages. Steve has destroyed or sold items totaling another $50,000. I turned to Bill Morrison. "You say Dad would be ashamed? Here's an invoice for the specialty tools Steve sold, including the planer you helped Dad restore in 1998. It's now in a pawn shop on Division Street." Bill's face went white. I pulled out my phone, showed them the photos, the before and after gallery I'd compiled. The destruction was undeniable when presented sequentially. "Mrs. Blackwood, you talk about sharing. Steve's son Liam sold Dad's tool collection and kept the money. Is that sharing?" "Pastor Williams, you mentioned honoring thy mother. What about the fourth commandment's full text? Honor thy father and thy mother? My father's legacy deserves honor too." I saved the best for last. Security footage from the neighbor's camera, which they'd shared with me after seeing Steve hauling away Dad's things. The timestamp showed Steve and Liam loading Dad's awards into a dumpster at 2 a.m., 3 days after telling everyone they'd been accidentally discarded. "This man," I pointed at Steve, "isn't trying to help my mother. He's systematically stripping her of everything my father built while convincing her, and all of you, that I'm the villain." Steve tried to interrupt, but I wasn't done. "Mom," I said, finally looking at her directly, "I have one more thing." I pulled out Dad's journal, the one I'd rescued from the trash. "This is Dad's handwriting, his private thoughts. May I read one entry?" She nodded slightly, tears streaming down her face. "March 15th. Sophia brought Margaret flowers today for no reason. She knows how to make her mother smile. I watch them together and feel such peace. Sophia will take care of Margaret when I'm gone, not because I asked her to, but because that's who she is. She protects what she loves, even when it costs her everything." My voice cracked. The room was tomb silent. "I'm not trying to hurt my mother. I'm trying to save what's left of my father. And if that makes me the villain in your story, Steve, then so be it. But everyone here has now seen the truth." I set down one final photograph, Dad and me in his workshop, both covered in sawdust, grinning at the camera. Mom had taken that picture 2 months before he died. "This is what you're destroying," I said to Steve. "This is what you're asking me to let go." People started shifting, whispering. Some looked at Steve differently now. Others studied the photos I'd left spread on the coffee table. Jim Fletcher, Dad's poker buddy who'd shunned me at the gas station, picked up the invoice for the tools. "That's my signature," he said slowly. "I helped Richard certify these tools for insurance. They were museum quality." "They needed to declutter," Steve said weakly. "Museum quality tools aren't clutter," Jim replied, his voice hardening. "Richard spent 30 years collecting these." The tide was turning. People started asking Steve direct questions. Where did the tools go? Why was the construction done without permits? How much had he made from selling Richard's belongings? Steve's smooth salesman facade cracked. "This is ridiculous. I'm trying to help Margaret move forward." "By destroying everything her husband built?" Dr. Patterson, my old pediatrician, stood up. "I've been in this house for 30 years. Richard delivered my grandson's crib personally when my daughter couldn't afford one. That workshop you gutted? That's where he built it. One by one, people started remembering Richard Hale. Not the story Steve had sold them, but the real man, the one who'd helped rebuild the church after the fire, who'd donated his services to restore the historical society, who'd taught woodworking to troubled kids at the community center. And they started seeing Steve Coleman for what he was. The 60th day arrived with the kind of crisp Portland morning my father had loved. I stood outside the house with Robert Hayes, 2 police officers, and a locksmith. Steve had ignored every legal notice, every warning. He'd gambled that I wouldn't follow through. He'd lost that bet. When we knocked, Steve answered in his bathrobe, all arrogance gone. "You can't do this. Margaret lives here." "Mrs. Bay Hale has been offered alternative accommodation," Robert said smoothly. "The eviction notice was properly served. You have 1 hour to gather personal belongings." The next hour was chaos. Steve shouted about lawsuits, about rights, about cruelty. Liam tried to intimidate the officers until they made it clear that interference would mean arrest. Samantha live-streamed the whole thing until she realized her followers were siding with me in the comments. Mom stood in the doorway of what had been my childhood bedroom, looking lost. For a moment, our eyes met, and I saw a flicker of something, not quite recognition, but maybe the beginning of doubt about Steve's narrative. "Mom," I said quietly, "you don't have to leave. This is your home. It's Steve who has to go." She looked at Steve, who was trying to stuff Dad's remaining books into a garbage bag, books he'd called worthless weeks ago. She started, then stopped. "Margaret, don't listen to her," Steve commanded. "We stick together." But the spell was cracking. Mom looked around the house, really looked, saw the painted-over doorframe, the cheap furniture where Dad's handcrafted pieces once stood, the empty spaces where memories used to live. "The roses," she whispered suddenly. "Richard's roses. They're all dead." She was right. Steve had paved over Dad's prize-winning rose garden for his RV, the Elizabeth Taylors, the Mr. Lincolns, the double delights Dad had grafted himself, all gone. "We needed the parking space," Steve said dismissively. That was his mistake. Those roses were the one thing Mom had specifically asked him to preserve. "You promised," she said, her voice stronger. "You said you'd help me maintain Richard's roses." "Roses die, Margaret. Everything dies. We move on." "No," Mom said, and it was like watching her wake from a dream. "Richard's roses didn't just die. You killed them." The next part happened fast. Mom told Steve to leave. He tried to argue, to manipulate, to guilt, but the witnesses from the intervention had done their work. Half the neighborhood had shown up to watch, and they weren't on Steve's side anymore. Jim Fletcher and 3 other poker buddies stood at the property line like sentinels. Mrs. Patterson had her phone out, recording everything. Pastor Williams was there too, and when Steve appealed to him for help, he simply said, "I think it's time for you to go. Mr. Coleman." Steve left with his children, their belongings hastily packed in black garbage bags, a fitting metaphor. As his RV pulled away, I heard him tell Liam, "We'll sue. We'll take everything." They never did. Robert had made sure every document was airtight. Steve Coleman disappeared into whatever con game he played next, hopefully far from other grieving widows. Mom and I stood in the empty house afterward. The damage was extensive but not irreversible. Insurance would cover most of it, and I'd already contacted restoration specialists who'd worked with Dad. "I'm sorry," Mom said, and it came out broken. "I don't know how I let this happen." "Grief makes us vulnerable," I said, remembering Dad's words. He knew how to exploit that. It took 6 months to restore the house. We found craftsmen who'd learned from Dad, who understood what we were trying to preserve. The floors were salvageable after all. The workshop was rebuilt using Dad's own plans. We even found some of his tools in local pawn shops and bought them back. The doorframe couldn't be restored to show my height marks, but we started a new tradition. We planted a tree, a Portland rose, coincidentally, and began marking its growth instead. Dad would have liked that, I think, building something new while honoring what came before. Mom lives there still, but differently now. She's in grief counseling, real counseling, not Steve's manipulation disguised as support. She's learning to see the red flags she missed, to trust her instincts again. Last week, she called me crying. Happy tears this time. She'd found a box of Dad's things Steve had hidden in the attic, including his wedding ring and the watch his father had given him. Steve had probably planned to sell them but forgot in his hasty exit. "Your father protected us," she said. "Even after he was gone, he protected us." She was right. Through the trust, through his careful planning, through the daughter he'd raised to fight for what mattered, Richard Hale had protected his legacy and his family from beyond the grave. The house stands strong now, properly restored, a testament to real love and real craftsmanship. Not everything can be recovered. Some things once broken stay broken, but the foundation Dad built, both in wood and in values, proves stronger than any con man's scheme. Sometimes I stand in Dad's rebuilt workshop, running my hands over the familiar wood, and I can almost hear his voice. "Good work, Sophie. You measured twice and cut once. You took care of what mattered." I did. Dad, I really did. Thank you for listening to my story. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts. Have you ever had to stand up to family to protect something important? I'd love to hear your experiences.